It started innocently enough. Marissa was a young woman in her mid-20s, fresh out of college and starting a new job in a small town. She had just moved into an apartment on the quieter side of the city, away from the bustling downtown. Her life was predictable, peaceful, until the day she noticed someone watching her from across the street. At first, she shrugged it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. But the staring became more frequent. The man across the street was always there, whether she was leaving for work in the morning or returning at night. He never approached her, never spoke, but his eyes followed her every move. He was tall, scruffy, with unkempt hair and a thick, dark jacket. She couldn't help but feel uneasy. One night, after a particularly long shift at work, Marissa walked home through the dark streets. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the empty street. As she approached her apartment building, she felt the familiar sensation of being watched. When she turned to look, there he was, standing in the shadows of an alleyway. He didn't move, but his gaze was locked on her. Her heart raced, and she quickly ducked inside her building, locking the door behind her. The next few days were the same. Marissa began to avoid leaving her apartment after dark, but it didn't matter. He was always there, across the street, watching. It was as though he had memorized her schedule. Then came the night the phone calls started. At first, they were just hang-ups, but then the voice came, low, guttural, and haunting. "I see you," it said. Marissa's stomach turned. She hung up quickly, thinking it was a prank call. But the calls didn't stop. Night after night, the same voice saying the same thing. "I see you." Terrified, Marissa began to take extra precautions. She installed a peephole in her door, kept the lights on, and made sure the locks were secure. But one evening, as she was walking past the kitchen window, she froze. There, in the reflection of the glass, was the man. He was standing just outside her window, staring into her apartment. She gasped and stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The next morning, she called the police. The officer who responded was kind but couldn't offer much help. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a break-in, and the man was never found. The feeling of being watched, however, persisted. Things only grew worse. Marissa began to notice small changes around her apartment. A window slightly ajar, a chair moved, and once even her bed sheets had been rearranged. It was as though someone had been inside, watching her while she slept. She installed cameras around her apartment, but saw nothing suspicious on the footage. But then came the chilling discovery. One afternoon, while sorting through her mail, Marissa found a letter in an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph of her, taken through the kitchen window. It was the man standing behind a tree, his face partially obscured, but unmistakably watching her. That night, she decided to confront him. Armed with nothing but her phone and a baseball bat, she stepped out of her apartment and into the cold night air. The streets were eerily quiet. The only sound was the distant hum of a passing car. She walked towards the alley where she had seen him before, her heart pounding in her chest. As she rounded the corner, she froze. There, standing in the dark, was the man. He was watching her, just as he had every night. But this time, he didn't remain still. He began to move toward her, slowly, methodically. Marissa's blood ran cold. She turned to run, but stumbled, falling hard onto the concrete. She scrambled to her feet, barely able to keep her balance as she raced back towards the apartment. When she reached her door, she slammed it shut and locked it, her hands shaking. But she wasn't safe yet. From the hallway outside her door, she heard the faint sound of scratching. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. It was as though someone was trying to claw their way in. The next day, she moved out. She couldn't stay there any longer. She couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still watching her, still following her. She never found out who he was or why he stalked her. But she knew one thing for certain. Some things can't be explained. Some things are just too terrifying to understand. And as she looked over her shoulder one last time, she couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there, waiting in the shadow.
Story number 2.
It was late autumn when Hannah moved into the old house on Elm Street. The house had been vacant for years, its windows dusty, the paint peeling. But to Hannah, it was perfect, quiet, spacious, and affordable. She had always dreamed of living in a place with history, and this house had an eerie charm that drew her in. Little did she know, It had a history far darker than she could ever imagine. The first few days were peaceful. The creaky floorboards and strange noises in the night seemed like nothing more than the quirks of an old building. But after a week, things started to change. It began with the mirrors. She would catch glimpses of something moving behind her, something she couldn't explain. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the product of living alone for the first time. But then it started happening more frequently. She would turn around quickly, but nothing would be there. One night, she woke up to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. She lay frozen in her bed, listening intently. The steps came closer, then stopped. Her heart raced. She slowly reached for her phone and checked the time. It was 3:04 a.m. With trembling hands, she called the police, but when they arrived, they found nothing. There was no sign of anyone, no evidence of a break-in. The officers assured her it was probably a late-night animal, perhaps a raccoon or a stray dog. But Hannah knew better. The footsteps were human. They were deliberate. Over the next few days, she started to hear whispering in the walls. It was faint at first, just a murmur she could barely make out, but it grew louder and clearer over time. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, sinister, mocking, like something was laughing at her from behind the plaster. One evening, she decided to confront it. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight, she traced the sound to the basement door. The door creaked open, revealing a dark stairwell leading down into the depths of the house. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs. The air was thick, the smell of mildew and decay filling her nostrils. At the bottom, there was a small room she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind an old shelving unit. As she pushed the shelves aside, the light from her flashlight flickered and revealed something horrifying. A wall, covered in strange symbols, scratched into the stone. Some of them were recent, others seemed to be decades old. But in the center of the wall, there was one symbol that caught her eye, a symbol of an eye, carved so deeply that it almost looked as though it was staring at her. Frozen in place, Hannah felt something cold brush against her neck. She spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, and she could swear she heard a voice call her name. Hannah! She ran back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind her, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next night, the nightmares began. In her dreams, she would be back in the basement, staring at the symbols on the wall. But this time, something was different. There was a figure standing in the shadows, tall, hunched, its face hidden beneath a dark hood. Its hands were twisted, fingers unnaturally long, reaching out for her. Every time she tried to scream, no sound would come out. The figure would get closer, and just as it reached for her, she would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing. It didn't take long before the strange occurrences began to happen during the day. She would be sitting in her living room when the lights would flicker, and she would hear that same whispering from the walls. It was no longer confined to the basement. It was everywhere. She couldn't escape it. Her own reflection in the mirrors began to act strangely. Sometimes her reflection would smile when she didn't, or move slightly out of sync with her actions. One night, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror, a figure stood behind her, its face obscured in shadow, its mouth stretched into a grin. Terrified, Hannah did the only thing she could think of. She tried to leave, but when she tried to pack her things, she found that the door to the outside wouldn't open. She pulled and pulled, but it was as though the house itself was refusing to let her go. The windows wouldn't budge either, as if they were sealed shut by an invisible force. Then came the final night. She was lying in bed, trying to keep her eyes closed, trying to escape the horror of what was happening. But the whispers grew louder, and the house seemed to be alive with movement. She could feel something moving through the walls, circling her, waiting for the right moment. At 3:04 a.m., the footsteps returned. They were no longer outside her door. They were inside her room. The door creaked open, and she saw it. Tall, hunched, the same figure from her nightmares. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, filled with rows of jagged, pointed teeth. It whispered her name in a voice that sounded like the scraping of nails on a chalkboard. Hannah screamed, but no sound came out. The last thing she saw was the figure reaching for her, its hands closing around her throat. The next morning, the house was empty. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no trace of Hannah. Her belongings were still scattered throughout the rooms, but she was gone, as though the house had swallowed her whole. And from that day on, the house on Elm Street remained vacant once more, waiting for its next victim. And if you listen closely, you might hear the faint whispering of someone calling your name just before you two disappear into the dark.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the trees, the sound eerie and unsettling as Sarah pulled her car into the driveway of the old rundown house. It was the kind of place people avoided, the type of house you only found at the end of long, overgrown roads, hidden by twisted trees that seemed to reach for the sky. Sarah wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, but after losing her job and feeling overwhelmed by life, she needed a place to escape. The house was cheap, and she'd heard rumors about it, how it had been abandoned for decades, how no one ever stayed there for long. She didn't believe in any of it. She just needed peace and quiet. The first night was uneventful. She unpacked her things, made a cup of tea, and settled into the old armchair by the fireplace. The house was dark, but she liked it that way, the shadows adding to the quiet solitude she craved. But then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it echoed through the halls of the house, sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. She hesitated, then stood and walked to the door. No one was there. Confused, she shrugged it off as her imagination, perhaps a tree branch hitting the window in the wind. But the knocks continued, every night, always at the same time, a soft, steady tap on the front door, just as the clock struck midnight. After a few nights of the same, Sarah decided to investigate. She waited until the clock began to chime midnight, then slipped into the hallway, making her way to the front door. As she approached, the knock came again, just as it always did. She opened the door quickly, expecting to find nothing, or perhaps some prankster neighbor. But the porch was empty. Her breath caught when she looked down. There, on the welcome mat, was a single, freshly picked flower, a pale white daisy, its petals trembling in the cool night air. She picked it up, her fingers trembling, and brought it inside. For the rest of the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air in the house felt heavier, the shadows stretching longer, as if something was watching her from the corners of the rooms. The next night, the knocks came again. She didn't open the door this time. She stayed in her room, trying to ignore the noise, but it was impossible. The steady tapping continued, getting louder and more insistent. She covered her ears with her hands, trying to block out the sound, but it felt like it was coming from inside her head, echoing in her skull. The following day, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just the door anymore. It was everywhere. The mirrors in the house reflected movements that weren't her own, and the floors creaked even when she was the only one in the house. The feeling of being followed grew stronger every day, until she couldn't even step into the hallway without turning around, convinced someone was just behind her. Then came the dreams. They started as fleeting images, just shadows in her sleep, but they grew more vivid each night. She would dream of standing in front of the house, staring up at the broken windows and rotting door. But when she stepped inside, the house was different, alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The walls would shift and bend, and in the distance, she could hear whispering, distant voices calling her name, coaxing her to come closer. Each night, the dreams became darker. In the final dream, Sarah stood in the center of the house, surrounded by the shadows. The whispers became louder, more frantic, and then she saw them, figures emerging from the darkness, pale and thin, their eyes empty, hollow. They reached for her, their hands cold and clammy, and they whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." She woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for air, her heart pounding. It was just a dream, she told herself, but the fear lingered. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. The knocks at the door continued, but now they had a different sound. It wasn't just a tap anymore, it was a pounding, loud and violent, as if someone was trying to break in. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move on their own, twisting like fingers reaching out for her. One night, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She decided to leave. She grabbed her things and rushed to the front door, but as she reached for the handle, the knocking came again, this time louder and more forceful than ever. The door wouldn't open. It was as if something on the other side was holding it shut, preventing her from escaping. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble, and the house groaned as though it were waking from a long slumber. The whispers returned. Only now they were louder, more distinct. They weren't in her mind anymore. They were coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. "Stay! You belong here." Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but the house seemed to close in around her, its walls pressing tighter, suffocating her. The last thing she heard before everything went black was a soft whisper, right behind her ear. "We've been waiting for you." The next day, the house stood empty once again. No one ever saw Sarah again, and the house was left to rot, just as it had before. But every so often, when the wind howls through the trees and the night is still, you might hear the soft sound of knocking from inside the house. And if you listen closely enough, you might hear a voice, faint and distant, whispering your name.
Story number 4.
It was a quiet, peaceful town, nestled away from the hustle and bustle of city life. Samantha had just moved there, hoping to escape her stressful job and start anew. The house she rented was charming, a quaint little cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by trees. The kind of house that looked like it belonged in a storybook. Everyone in town seemed to know everyone else, and they all gave her warm, welcoming smiles when she arrived. But there was one thing about the house that everyone whispered about behind her back: the attic. No one ever went up there. The previous tenant had left abruptly, and the neighbors spoke of strange noises coming from the attic at night. They said the house had a history, something dark, something wrong. But Samantha was skeptical. She had always been the rational type. Superstitions didn't sway her. The first few nights were peaceful enough. But on the fourth night, she woke up to a faint scratching sound coming from the attic. It was subtle at first, like an animal trying to claw its way out, but as the night wore on, it grew louder, more frantic. Her pulse quickened, and she lay frozen in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the noise to stop. But it didn't. She got up, her feet cold on the wooden floor, and crept into the hallway. The attic door was just at the top of the stairs, covered by a thick, dusty cloth. She stood there, staring at it, her heart pounding in her chest. The scratching was almost maddening now, non-stop, like something desperate was trying to escape. Samantha hesitated, but curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and slowly made her way to the attic door. As she reached for the handle, the scratching stopped. A chill ran down her spine, but she told herself it was just her imagination. She turned the handle and pulled open the door, the hinges creaking with an eerie groan. The attic was dark, the beam from her flashlight barely illuminating the corner where the stairs led up. But something caught her eye, something small, moving. She stepped up onto the first stair, then another, until she was fully inside. There, in the far corner of the attic, was an old, dusty rocking chair. It was rocking back and forth slowly, as if someone was sitting in it, but no one was there. The chair creaked with each movement, its motion unnatural, like an invisible presence was forcing it to sway. Samantha's breath hitched. She couldn't take her eyes off the chair, her body frozen in place. And then, just as her heart began to race, the chair stopped. Complete stillness. Then, something far worse happened. From behind her, she heard a low whisper, faint and chilling. "Samantha." She spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the attic. Nothing. Just shadows. But the voice had been clear, too clear. Her heart pounded harder now, her instincts screaming for her to leave. She backed away, her eyes darting around the attic, but she couldn't tear herself away from the space where the rocking chair had been. That's when she saw it, an old tattered photo on the floor, partially hidden under a pile of old blankets. It was yellowed with age, its edges curled. Hesitant, she reached down and picked it up. The photo showed a family, a man, woman, and 2 children. The family looked happy, but there was something wrong with the way they were positioned, something off about the way they were staring into the camera. They all had blank, emotionless expressions, and in the background, Samantha noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small figure standing in the shadows, barely visible, its face obscured, but its hands were unnaturally long, and they were reaching toward the family. Suddenly, the temperature in the attic dropped, and she could see her breath in the air. The whisper came again, louder this time. "You shouldn't have come here." Her legs buckled beneath her as the flashlight slipped from her grip, crashing to the floor. She scrambled to her feet, heart racing as she bolted toward the door. But before she could reach it, something grabbed her ankle, yanking her back with terrifying strength. She screamed, her voice strangled as she struggled to free herself. The scratching noise from before returned, louder and closer, as though whatever had been trapped in the attic was now right behind her, closing in. Finally, she managed to break free, tearing herself away from whatever had a hold of her. She rushed down the stairs, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, as though something was holding it from the other side. Panicking, she slammed her body into the door again and again, until it finally burst open. She stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air, and turned to see the attic door slamming shut on its own. Samantha left the house that night, not looking back. She never returned. The next day, when the landlord came to check on her, the house was eerily quiet. No one was inside. The rocking chair, however, was back where it belonged, gently rocking back and forth. And in the photo Samantha had found, the shadowy figure was now standing right behind the family, its face clear and smiling, as though it had always been part of the picture.